So, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Flo. Thanks for the introduction. And maybe just to position myself in this, I don't farm as an urban agriculturalist, but I have been involved in working with urban agriculture for the past 15 years, really from my initial engagements with the Philippine horticultural area way back in about 2006 or 7. And I suppose I'm not going to speak to what I imagine others would speak to, so I certainly agree with the nutritional benefits, the ability to close the circular, to kind of close the flows of food into and out of the system, but also other waste streams. I'm a little bit more skeptical. The work that we do doesn't really show much evidence of great livelihoods generation, but there are a whole set of other solidarity, connecting back to the environment, educational benefits, and multiple benefits from that. But I think in the context of how the presentation was presented, or how the session was presented, was really about asking about this emergence of new networks and how these networks have connected to other networks, how there's this desire to make feeding programs more sustainable, but also the emergence and re-emergence of the state in this kind of focus on urban agriculture. And then the question around, is this diverting attention away from something? And as you may have seen from my title, I want to try and focus on that. Just, I do also want to say that just for me, it's useful to speak to my own work that we've done. So I'm going to draw on some of those to try and position my argument and to pose the questions that I hope will stimulate some conversation later. But one of the things that I do want to sort of pay attention to is this emergence of the urban food and questions of urban food, and how this debate has changed, certainly since those early days of 2006 when I started working in this, and how this work has moved to a more food system focus rather than intervention, how key kind of challenges that are noted within the system are mostly driven by inequity and inequality. And it's not necessarily, poverty is certainly a key issue, but how do you deal with the gross inequalities that we have in South Africa, and how does that inform our responses and how we imagine what those responses might be? And then also how this focus has shifted away from creating availability to these questions of utilization, and how does that interact with how food is accessed. And for me, COVID certainly raised this question of the type of food that is being consumed and the type of food that our food system currently provides, in terms of how Cape Town battled with the sort of severity of COVID when it connected to the food system outcomes of type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and everything like that. And so this new focus in food system responses, and I want to ask, is that evident in how the discourse and how we're imagining these responses going forward might play out? I know this is a definition that some people dislike. They feel it depoliticizes the question of food insecurity, and it does. It normalizes food insecurity. We have this arbitrary measure of a percentage of food insecure. But I think it is useful to ask us to focus on multiple components. So not just availability, but also accessibility, how food is used, the sort of stability of that food system, the long-term sustainability now with a new definition, but also voice and agency, and how power and other things are asserted in that system. So just to ask if that runs in the background while I speak to some of the things that I want to talk to. So this is work that we did in the Hungry Cities Partnership, and this was pre-COVID. And so I think when most of civil society have had to respond to this dramatic fall into hunger. If you look at this and you see the sort of numbers around moderately and severely food insecure across income terciles, from the lowest incomes in quintile 1 right the way through, one can certainly see the significant inequality in Cape Town's food system in terms of how the outcomes of that food system respond and how it's evident. But you know, the fact that nearly 91% of the lowest income tercile were food insecure, either severely or moderately, before COVID actually hit. So what happened when resources, access to work, networks, etc., were all closed out? That fall into poverty, not just from quintile 1, but right the way up into almost middle income households, fell quite far into hunger. Whether they experienced hunger or changed what they ate dramatically to more staples and cheaper food and more processed food that's often cheaper is another question. The dietary diversity is also a key indicator of kind of the risk. And here you see the lowest income terciles, and here 6 is a proxy indicator for potential undernutrition. So again, you see these challenges faced, as well as sort of the months of adequate food provisioning, where certainly a lot of people have months where they are really concerned. And this, for me, just shows how vulnerable Cape Townians are to food insecurity and food poverty, but also how flawed our South African food system actually is. This assumption that people are being fed is one thing, but whether they're being fed decent, nutritious food and whether they're being able to attain wellness from these figures, clearly, I don't believe that's the case, on how our food system responds at this point in time. But also how people access food and where do they access. And here I've divided it by high, middle, and low income. And I just want to point to the top of the screen around growing food and how that plays out. And I'll come to that later, but how the low income households use multiple food access points. And what the lockdown did was shut down all of these and directed everyone to the supermarket. And yes, everyone uses the supermarket, but uses it very differently. And that's just one thing to bear in mind around how the food system functions and how different income groups respond to that. So this for me is an interesting graph, and this was from our survey where you can see the sort of breakdown. There were about 200 high income households, part of it 500 middle, and a lot more low income households, just to match the spread across Cape Town. And this is a percentage of households who engaged in, who accessed food through food that was grown by their household. And the low income households are certainly not as active and not accessing food in the same way. And I think that, for me, asks a number of questions. You know, as an activist, one might turn around and say, yes, definitely, we need to focus more on this and allow these low income households better access to land, better access to resources. And these are all things that perhaps they're not doing urban agriculture now because they lack access to land, resources, and those sort of things. But it does also speak to the agency and how people across society choose to respond to inadequacies that they see or experience in the food system. And it does, for me, pose the question, is growing food the optimal response? Is it seen as the key strategic response in terms of how food is accessed? And so this is just to step away from growing and accessing food and things like that, but it's another part of this work that we did, where we try to understand the lived poverty experience. And again, this is high, middle, and low income groups combined. And we ask them, how often in the last year did you ever go without enough food to eat, enough clean water, enough medicine, electricity, enough fuel to cook? And the reason I present this is that it shows, certainly from the red and gray lines, how a number of areas people went without. And this was pre-COVID again. So you can imagine how COVID extended these kind of vulnerabilities. But it does, for me, speak to the fact that when we think of food, it's not just the food and the raw material food that's available. Food intersects with how that food is cooked, the energy that's available, the water that is accessible, not just to clean and prepare the food, to water a garden, etc. So these wider urban system issues connect to food. And so what does that then mean when we're trying to intervene in the question of severely inadequate food system? One of the other questions we asked was how important pensions and grants and things like that are to the different incomes. And here we see the significant importance of pensions and grants to the low income households. You see from a range from about 25% of the high income respondents, which was mostly pensions that they've been able to save for, down to the role that the grants played for the low income households. And so what is this? How important is social protection, and how does that provide a buffer, and what does that mean? Again, pre-COVID, and obviously with COVID, there was a whole set of other forms of social protection going into society. I want to step back a little bit and then say, okay, so what is the role of local government in the food system, and how should local government be responding to this? And the reason I wanted to bring this in is because frequently in our discussions with city and other officials, the response is that food is not an urban mandate. Food security is not something that city governments should be focusing on. And here what we've got is all the different directorates, and this is from work done in 2014 with Jane Battersby and colleagues of ours, that looked at what food system role and food security role and the kind of level of importance across different city directorates, across city management, and I know some are in the room, spatial planning, others are in the room at the moment, transport, health, and all of these. And I think this is shown through COVID of how important these are to try and come together to respond to certain aspects, certainly in terms of early childhood development and the food that is fed in the ECD areas and others. And so is this an unfunded mandate? Is this an absent mandate? Or is this something that requires quite serious focus and application? And is it just about finding land and doing some projects to grow food and support farmers and others? I would argue, and I'm sure you see how I'm building to this, is that it has to be about far more and a far greater systemic response to this. And to demonstrate this, I've just taken some work by a colleague of mine, Amira Berger, who looked at the various different food groups and how this flowed through the system to informal traders, supermarkets, wholesalers, a whole set of actors. And then the green marks in this and the green points speak to the role of the informal economy. So again, a different economy, not just the supermarkets, but the diversity of this. And here, fresh produce is particularly important. And one can see how a lot of that fresh produce is still going into informal trading and other areas. So this sort of question of the food system versus just the sort of the urban agriculture component, I think there's a far greater need to look beyond just the project and look at a whole set of other components in the food system and how governance, how policies, how the silos in government and both local and provincial and others, how they constrain or enable these particular aspects to function to create an efficient food system. Another part of this, and I mentioned my work in the PHA, is to look at a part of the food system and the urban agriculture debate that I haven't heard in the period of COVID. And I certainly haven't heard any mention of this besides a small mention around the PHA. But the figure on your screen shows all the peri-urban areas that are deemed agricultural land. And in the various different spatial development reports, one would see the kind of ratings of that between high and low value land, high, medium, and low. But here are a whole set of areas of land. And I ask the question, if we're advocating for this far greater focus on urban agriculture, how has the status of this land changed over time? And what has led to, I would argue, the sort of degrading of this land, this absent focus, and how it hasn't been received the focus necessary in the urban agriculture debate? We're focusing on kitchen gardens and small scale production, but these large productive areas that can certainly recycle waste flows, that can produce slightly larger kind of quantities of a variety of different food types linked to what people might consume, why are these then not considered as important? And why aren't we active in trying to lobby for these areas? Some are, but many of them are disregarded, and certain areas are, the wine growing areas attain far greater protection than some of the food growing areas. And so, to be somewhat controversial and try and look at how I've seen the responses shift. So in the initial stage of COVID, I saw significant attention on the system and the system failures. As time has gone on, I've seen that focus retreat into a focus, and these are my arbitrary sort of kind of weightings of the different sides of the circles and the connections, just from my own experience. I'm sure they can be contested, but I've seen an intervention, poverty, and availability focus dominating instead of focusing on the system, trying to understand and having the tough conversations about inequality. And I haven't seen much of a conversation around questions of utilization, the types of food, and how that might play out. And so from that, I ask, why is urban agriculture sort of promoted with such enthusiasm when other things that clearly have great utility to the poor, like universal income support and others, aren't being lobbied as strongly? And why do we, as kind of a collection of food system actors, promote sort of these projects over trying to collaborate to address these long and often deeply held historical systemic issues in the system? Kind of why are the sort of assets that we have not part of that same conversation? Why isn't there far greater attention trying to preserve the Mamre and Justenburg-Flocta and others? Why are we focusing? And I understand that it might be linked to cans and where there was specific focus and networks that built, but how do we take that far broader systems perspective if we are going to be active around our arguments for urban agriculture? And then kind of which governance actors are let off the hook when they're allowed to and even kind of recognize for these unmonitored projects, and why don't we hold them to their constitutional obligation to kind of ensure the right to food and their mandates that are detailed in sections 4 and 5 that the Optifus and others within the community of practice have already argued. And the difficult question for me, and I want to know if urban agriculture and this focus on it in some ways doesn't run the risk, and I'm not saying it does, but I think in some ways, in some of the articulations and some of the ways I've heard it pronounced, I wonder if it doesn't normalize poverty and hunger. It relieves those that are responsible for addressing that, and it places the responsibility on the poor. And because they're often poorly managed, poorly monitored by those that are promoting it, both certainly in the city and elsewhere, and some would say it's not poorly managed and monitored, but certainly a lot of the city-run projects, that is the case. There is no monitoring that happens after the suitcases have been provided and the seeds. When they fail, the poor then get blamed for that failure. And so again, we sort of normalize this hunger and we blame the poor for their inability. And how do we avoid the risk of that being the case? So let me leave it there. Thank you very much.